right, how's it going, guys? Pretty good? We only have 4 weeks left, huh? For this class? Pretty much, like if you don't count this week, right? It's only 4 weeks. Wow. So, first priority today is to get through this assignment number 3. So we're all on the same page, we all understand what's going on. I will have your papers back to you by the end of this week sometime. But yeah, the third assignment is up. It's available on Blackboard, the usual place under assignments on the left-hand side of Blackboard, the Blackboard homepage for this course. And let's just go through it. So we're on ethics now, guys. So the third assignment, this is the third assignment, how to determine right and wrong, which is basically what ethics is all about. You know, there are different ethical theories out there. And the theoretical part of an ethical theory is to explain what makes an action or a person right or wrong or good or bad. They also have a practical aspect too, that is to help you make ethical decisions. So a good ethical theory will not only explain what makes things right and wrong, it'll also somehow give you some way to test in any given situation, whether it's abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, whatever it is, it'll give you some way to make practical decisions about whether or not to take that particular action, whether or not to abort, whether or not to kill someone who killed someone else, whether or not to take your own life if you're suffering too much, that kind of thing. Each one of these ethical theories gives a framework for thinking about many different issues. So one way you can think about which theory is better is how many issues it can solve at the same time. Can it solve 10 or 20 or even 30 of our contemporary moral issues? Or can it only solve 1 or 2? That's one way you can think about what makes an ethical theory good, all right? There's other considerations as well, but that's just one of them. All right, so for your third assignment, it's ethics or how to determine right and wrong. Let's go through the basics. You already know this, but I'm just gonna reemphasize it. Must be a minimum of 3 to 4 pages, double spaced. Must be submitted in Microsoft Word so that I can type in whatever I need in the document. It's due on November 2nd, this third one. You should submit it by email midnight on November 2nd, midnight on November 2nd to that email there, jio9@miami.edu. It's worth 25% of your total grade. There are 5 questions, and each question is worth 5% of the 25% that makes up your grade for this assignment. All right? So there are 5 questions. Let's go question by question. Number 1, what is the relationship between free will and determinism and ethics? How are those 2 things related? We talked about that in class. Now I want you to think a bit deeper about that, what we talked about in class. Why will certain institutions and ethics either be acceptable or unacceptable based on what conclusions you reach about determinism or libertarianism or compatibilism? That's what I want you to think about. Number 2, what is the relationship between personal identity and ethics, right? We talked a little about this last class, but basically throughout history, there's good reason to believe many human beings were not counted as actual persons. That is, beings worthy of dignity and respect and human rights. If you look throughout history, you can see a whole bunch of whole demographics that were left out of what it means to truly be a person. So I want you to think a little bit about that. What's the relationship between being a person and ethics? How do those impact each other? All right? And then what is your understanding of the values of good and bad, right and wrong, and permission, obligation, and prohibition? What do these things mean? So this is just pure philosophy at this point. Like, we use terms like good and bad all the time, right and wrong. We talk about things being permitted or permissible. We talk about things being mandatory or obligatory. And we talk about things being prohibited or forbidden. I just want you to think a little bit deeper about what all of that means and their relationship to each other, right? So think of it this way. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but if we say something is right, that actually means several things, at least two things. If we say what you're doing right now is right, and it's not wrong, it's right, that could mean something like it's permitted, right? You're doing the right thing. You're doing something permitted. But it could also mean, hey, you're not just permitted to do that, you're required to. It's obligatory. So that word right actually covers a larger category. It covers two really big categories. So doing the right thing can be further broken down into very interesting categories. And those categories themselves, you got to decide between both of those, right? As your parents age, are you permitted to take care of them, or are you obliged to take care of them? There's a very big difference between those two things. You see that? If you have a kid, are you permitted to pay child support and have custody, or are you obliged? Is it obligatory for you to pay child support and have custody? Very big, like both of those are right. You're doing the right thing, but both from a legal and an ethical perspective, that word obligation is completely different from the word permission. They're just completely different. They overlap in that both of them are right. If something is permitted, then it's right, it's okay to do. And if something is required, it's also right. You're doing the right thing in both cases, but they are very different, okay? So I want you to think about that on the basis of what we're going to discuss. All right, number 4, which ethical theory best determines these values? That's what we're going to discuss starting today and next 3 weeks, right? If you're going to say one particular thing is bad, or one particular thing is good, or something is right or wrong, or something is obligatory or mandatory, or something is forbidden or prohibited, these ethical theories need to be giving us reasons why we assign those values to those particular actions, or to those particular policies, or to those particular persons, right? If we say keeping immigrants out of our country, especially the ones who are illegal, if we say a policy of keeping our immigrants, a policy of keeping illegal immigrants out of our country is good, then we need an ethical theory that's going to support that. How did you arrive at that value good for this policy that keeps immigrants who are illegally here out of our country? All right? And there's different ethical theories. There's divine command theory, right? Divine command theory basically says the only way something turns out to be good or bad, right or wrong, is if God commanded it. And if there is no God to command it, then there is no moral law. And if you have no moral lawgiver like God, and you have no moral law, anything is permitted. We're just animals. Some people would say, like Dostoevsky would think something like that, right? That's what Dostoevsky would think. And Nietzsche, maybe to a certain extent, might think something like that. And then we've got consequentialism, right? We're going to talk about all these theories. We're going to spend all this week on consequentialism. Consequentialism, as the word suggests, is the ethical theory that says the way that you determine right and wrong and good and bad is by looking at the what? Come on. Yeah, so if you're about to take an action and you want to figure out whether it's permissible or whether it's good, you look at the consequences of that action. And that's a whole umbrella term for all sorts of theories that qualify as consequentialist, meaning the end justifies the means. Or you have to look to the outcome or the result or the consequence to figure out whether what you're doing now, the action, is justified. Okay? That's an entire school of thought. We're going to get into that today and a little bit on Wednesday. We got deontology. That's Greek. Deon means duty, and ology means study. So the study of your duties. Very, very interesting, guys. Some people say, what could matter more than the outcome or the result or the consequences of your action? That's all that matters. And others are going to say, no way. It's not the consequences that matter. It's the intention. It's the motive that matters. Even if all the consequences are completely horrible, if it was done with a pure heart and a noble intention, and that means if it was done from a sense of duty, that's all that matters in determining the moral worth of the action. So if you're trying to assign a value to the action, some people say, look in the future to the consequence or the outcome or the result. And other people say, no, this is the exact opposite. Don't look to the future, look to the past. Look to where that action is originating. What's the motive behind that action? Where did it come from? Did it come from a sense of duty and obligation? Did this person figure out what their duties are and then they perform the action required by their duty? Or were they just kind of like going through life as a free spirit and their motives are all confused, or they're only coincidentally dutiful, they only coincidentally coincide with their duty? We're going to see a philosopher called Immanuel Kant, who argues that it is not the outcome that matters at all. It's the motive. And a very particular motive is the one that counts, the only one that counts. And that is the motive of duty. And then last, we're going to go way back in time to ancient Greece, to Aristotle. Consequentialism is going to be a very modern kind of theory. It's going to be John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, two Englishmen who came up with this theory. And then Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher towards the end of the Enlightenment, came up with deontology. Now, deontology has another version, the one I told you at first, divine command theory. Because God, who gives moral laws, also, if he gives you a law, then he also gives you duties or things you ought to do. So there are two kinds of deontology. There's the theological, religious deontology, where God gives you duties, and then there's the Kantian deontology, where somehow your reason itself can give you commands that tell you what you ought to do. All right? And then finally, back in ancient Greece, Aristotle, virtue ethics. Now that's an entirely different theory too. It's not the outcome that matters, and it's not the motive. Rather, it's the kind of person you're going to become, or the kind of person you are, that determines whether or not the action is good. So basically, it's not the outcome that matters, and it's not the motive. It's rather whether or not you have a character of a certain kind, and whether or not the particular action you're taking is consistent with a virtuous character. Would a virtuous person, a person who is morally excellent in certain ways, would a virtuous person perform that kind of action? And if a virtuous person would either permit himself to perform that action or be obliged to do it, then it's an okay action. It's a right action. But if a virtuous person, acting out of his full character, would avoid that action, then Aristotle would say that's what a wrong action is. And those are the three big theories. One very ancient, two very modern. The two, consequentialism and deontology, are basically from the 19th century Europe. And then Aristotle is from the ancient world, Greece. And Aristotle is also very person-centered, right? You're really judging the person. You're judging their character on the basis of their virtues or their vices. Whereas the other two, you're really judging the actions. So we're going to go through this over the next 3 weeks. So guys, the next 3 weeks is all ethics, and then the last week is going to be existentialism. So number 5, how does this ethical theory determine these values, and how successfully does it do so compared to other ethical theories? So number 4, look at what number 4 is asking you. It's saying, out of all these theories, which one best determines those values, right? And that you could look at that a number of ways. When I say best determines, that could be on a single issue. If all of them were competing, which one determines it the best, say for abortion? Or you could think of it this way. You could look at the whole range of issues out there and look at the one that you think is most comprehensive, the one that addresses most of the issues we have. Maybe one does 8 out of 10, the other does 6 out of 10, the other one only does 5 out of 10. So I'm going to leave the approach up to you, but that's what I'm asking in number 4. And then in number 5, once you've identified the ethical theory that you think is the best, number 5 is asking you, how does that ethical theory determine these values? And how successfully does it do so compared to the other ethical theories? So now you have to give some comparison. You have to say, look, I think virtue ethics does really, really good on issues like end of life issues like suicide, assisted suicide, euthanasia, but it doesn't do so good on women's rights issues, or that kind of thing, right? Do some comparison. Just really think through it, and I just want your feedback, and you should do fine, just like you've done on the other ones. Any questions? All right, so it's already up on Blackboard. You have until November 2nd, and that'll be the end for there, okay? All right, guys, so now that we've done that, I want to formally introduce the next part of the course that we're in. This part of the course is now axiology. Now, axiology. Axiology is the study of values, the nature of values, the source of values, how we determine values, the kinds of values that are out there. And there are 2 big parts of axiology. One is what we're going to start doing this week, ethics. Ethics is about values like good and bad, right and wrong. But there's another one too, and that's aesthetics. And aesthetics is about what really makes good art, what really makes something beautiful. So the values in aesthetics are beauty, ugliness, that kind of thing. And also what counts as good taste, bad taste, what counts as good art and bad art, what even counts as art at all right? So that's the kind of thing that aesthetics does. Today I'm going to do a little bit of aesthetics just so you get a taste of it, but we're not going to go very deep in aesthetics. And one of the reasons why I made this decision, guys, to treat axiology almost totally from the ethical perspective and not the aesthetic, is that there's a very, very important difference between the two in terms of practice or practicality. If you really think about it, both ethics and aesthetics are practical in a certain sense. There's a theoretical part of them, how you figure out what's right and wrong in the most abstract, general way, how you figure out what's beautiful and ugly, right? There's a theoretical part, and there are aesthetic theories that try to do that. And there are ethical theories that try to do that. But they also have a very big practical side. The practical side to art is creativity. Creativity is the practical side to art, for the most part. I guess you can also use works of art to instruct, to console. Some of the best art has been religious. So there's a lot of overlap with other things. But for the most part, the practical part of art is creativity. And that's a very different kind of practicality than the practical side of ethics. Ethics is also very practical, but this time it's not just creativity. The practical side of ethics involves things like, what ought I to do? That word ought is something lacking in pure art. Artists don't really concern themselves with the question, what ought I to do? Except maybe which one of these ways of painting or singing or making film will best fit my content. But it's not normative in the same way that ethics is. Ethics literally confronts you with the issue of, ought I to have an abortion or not? ought I to have capital punishment in the state of Florida or not? This is literally putting a weight, a burden on you. You need to figure out if this is the kind of thing that's permitted or even obligatory or prohibited. And this involves people's lives. This involves the quality of people's lives. So here the word practical takes on a huge, huge burden that's not there in the aesthetic case. You're messing with people's lives. You're messing with the unborn. You're messing with quote unquote criminals who may or may not be there legitimately. Some of them might have been falsely accused, or there might be issues with the evidence that led them to death row. There's a whole bunch of issues, all right? So that's why I decided to spend more time on ethics. And like we were talking about before class, it has implications. Art is huge in our culture. So much of our entertainment is artistic. So I'm not gonna diminish art. However, even though art is a big part of our culture, I would argue that ethics is even bigger. Like ethics is the kind of thing that will cause protests depending on who the Supreme Court nominee is. That's how powerful ethics is. Ethics can determine a presidential election, right? That kind of thing. All right, so it's very practical. It really influences our lives in a deep way. And there's just so much at stake. So much is at stake. How we shape our society, how we distribute goods and services in our society, in our economy, how we shape our culture, the kind of values we transmit from generation to generation. And then overlapping with all of that is religion. So much of our ethics comes from religion. All right, so it's just some of the deepest aspects of what it is to be human have to do with our values. You cannot understand what it is to be human if you don't understand this aspect of human that's axiological. Human beings are the kinds of beings that evaluate things, estimate things. They constantly weigh things, one thing better than another, one thing more beautiful than another, right? That's what it is to be human. And as we conclude this part, the axiology part, we'll be heading into probably the most puzzling part of being human at all, which is what happens when an axiologist, instead of looking at particular actions or persons, looks at life itself, or what it is to be human, and asks himself, what is the value of being human, right? Is life worth living? Now that's existentialism. It's a kind of applied axiology, but it's applied to the concept of what it is to be human, or whether your life is worth living at all. So that's where we're going, guys, and that's where we're going to conclude. So that's what I want to build on now. I just want to remind you that when we're coming to this topic of ethics, a couple of things need to be said. Ethics primarily, especially when it comes to prohibitions and obligations, it applies only to a limited number of people who we call persons, all right? Persons. Only persons have human rights, and only persons have duties. Duties and rights, we do not assign those to inanimate things. We don't assign those to plants. We don't even assign those to animals. Whether or not we would assign those to AI or some alien, I don't know. It's something we've got to talk about. If a superior alien race visits us, how do we figure out whether to treat it like a cow, something to eat, or something to be bred, or more like a puppy, some sort of domesticated, pet, or more like a colleague or a peer? How do you figure that out? So that's one thing. And we have a lot of things to think about, because personhood, I want to suggest to you, we went through personhood really quickly last class, but this concept of personhood, it's so relevant to what we're doing. It's even more relevant than what we talked about last time. Last time we talked about, different demographics like gender and race, that kind of thing. But it's even deeper than that. Even if we push aside gender and race, we need to figure out what makes a person, given that human beings, if we divide human beings into body and mind, guess what, guys? Both bodies and minds are very Heraclitean. Remember Heraclitus? Heraclitus said everything is changing, everything is in flux. Let's start with the body. Some people argue that every 7 years, all the atoms in your body and all the cells rejuvenate themselves. After 7 years, all the old stuff is gone, and it's entirely new cells. Let's have implications. Because if you have that going on with your body, then obviously your mind is changing too, right? What do the empiricists say? All knowledge comes from experience through the form of ideas. So what is your mind? It's just a bunch of ideas. But those ideas are constantly changing. Every time you take a walk, every time you daydream, every time you actually dream, every time you go from one city to another city, every time you go from one school to another school, technically, what's happening is a change of ideas. You're having different ideas. But if you're having different ideas, that means your mind, like your body, is constantly changing. So whatever the person is, whether you identify with the body or with the mind, whatever the person turns out to be, it's constantly changing. Now, just like with free will, there's a problem, right? In free will, you can't make someone responsible if they don't truly have freedom, right? Now also look at personal identity. Can you make someone responsible if they are no longer the same person they were when they committed the crime? You see the problem? If a person is constantly changing, what level of change is so big that it would be wrong to incriminate that person for something either they don't remember, or their motives have changed, or they have grown up and they've matured emotionally, or they have a different character. You see where we're going with this? All of these things are relevant. All right. But it gets even worse than that. Personhood also determines who counts as a person, not just in terms of gender or race. Think about this, guys. A criminal. If a criminal is on death row, and a state like Florida has decided he's going to get the death penalty, that's a kind of judgment about whether or not that person is a full person with all the rights that we typically give a person. Maybe according to some theory of ethics, if you do certain things, you lose your personhood. I don't know, maybe Stalin or Hitler or Mao, maybe these are the type of people who did things that were so bad that, yeah, they're no longer human. They're no longer persons in the technical sense of the word. So at trials like Nuremberg or other courts, when you sentence them to death, some people would argue, yeah, that's justifiable. Certain criminals are technically not persons anymore. Okay? But we don't have to speak with criminals. What about a fetus? Is a fetus a person? Depending on your religious views, conception begins life. So some people would actually say when the zygote is formed, when the sperm hits the egg, that is a person. And obviously these are the pro-life people, right? This is what it means to be pro-life. This is what it means to be pro-life. There is a person, and what are the pro-choice people going to say? That's just an aggregate of cells. It doesn't even have consciousness. How can you call that a person? That's just a bunch of barely conscious, mass. It's not even an organ, let alone an organism, let alone a multicellular organism. It's barely even a piece of tissue. And you're going to call that a person? And not only you're going to call that a person, but you're going to give it more rights than a mom. So you're saying this group of tissues has more rights than a mom to choose what to do with her own body. Guys, when you hear problems, people upset about Supreme Court rulings like Roe v. Wade or stuff. This is the culture war. This is like a culture war that's going on. Religious people are going to say something like the formation of a zygote is conception. That is, God has a natural process in which when one thing happens materially, another thing is happening metaphysically. A soul is being created, and the person is identical to the soul. That's what they're going to say. On the other hand, the science people on the left are going to say, you got to be kidding me. We only find consciousness in complex organisms, complex multicellular organisms. A group of tissues is not, it's just not a human being. Not that small. And even a fetus in the first trimester is not a person. Now, if you go to the third trimester, all right, when the baby's anatomy is, the developmental biology is more sophisticated, and it looks more human, and it seems to respond to stimuli, okay, the third trimester, even the feminists would begin to chill, right? Doing an abortion in the last 2 months of the gestation period, even they would, they'd be like, okay. Because if you start messing around that area, then you might ask, okay, what's the difference between that, doing it a week before birth and a week after birth? See that? The line gets too thin. All right? I'm just trying to show you the relevance of all this stuff now. Is a sick or an elderly person technically a person? A sick person. If someone is so sick that they don't have consciousness, they're in a coma, they fainted, they're not coherent, are they still a person? These are the kind of things we have to confront. Personhood is crucial. Okay. Now, we're talking about ethics here. So, we have to confront some really serious issues here. One of the serious issues we have to confront, guys, is that we have to ask ourselves, how continuous are we with the rest of nature? And again, this gets religious and metaphysical again. Because if we're completely integrated into the rest of nature, and all we have flowing through our veins are just, erythrocytes, red blood cells, a bunch of hemoglobin, a bunch of biomolecules, macromolecules. And if we're just completely continuous with the rest of nature, then on what basis can we begin to make moral statements about what we do when we act and behave in analogous ways to, for example, animals? We might not have a mating season, but we sure do mate, right? We have testosterone in our blood, right? We have instincts, maybe, I don't know. Life in nature is possible under many, many conditions. In volcanoes you have life. Way deep under the sea you have life. I think they probably found microbes on Venus or Mars or something. Like life is this beautiful thing that can adapt to so many different situations. And from nature's perspective, the predator isn't any more evil than the prey. Everyone is just surviving and adapting. Okay? Now let's bring that back to us. Why isn't the same celebration of diversity that we can give to nature, why can't we bring that same thing here? Why can't we just get rid of morality and ethics in the normative sense and say, you know what? Different people have different healths. Health is not a standard thing. What's healthy for one person is unhealthy for the other. And then we can reintegrate things like aggression. And aggression can just become something purely natural, purely innocent almost. Why can't we go down that road? Why can't we say survival of the fittest, not only for resources that are biological, but even in our culture? Why can't we say all societies should be meritocracies, and whoever wants to go up in the highest levels is going to have to claw his way up there, and whoever succeeds in clawing his way up there is the winner. In fact, it's so beautiful because it's so simple. You don't have to overthink things. Might is right. Whoever is the most powerful, he's the person who should be in power. He's the person who has dominated everyone else. Alpha males naturally dominate everyone else. And since that's what naturally happens, why can't we say in our ethics, that's also what should happen? Yeah, the most dominant person should win. In a hyper-competitive environment, let the competition go on. Let the games begin. People are going to argue that in economics, right? If you want the best goods and services, don't follow communism. Don't be totalitarian. Don't try and micromanage everything. Do the opposite. Let the games begin. Just like you have Olympic Games and the best man wins, let the best person at entrepreneurship and commanding resources and meeting the demand in the market, let that person be free. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? This is a huge problem for ethics. If we talk about laissez-faire or capitalism or market-based economies, how did we get an iPhone? It wasn't engineered by the government. How did we get websites like Facebook and Amazon? There's a real problem we're facing here. Do you guys see what I'm saying? We're doing all this ethics and all these prohibitions and don't do this and don't do that. But there are suggestions both from nature as well as from certain parts of our history that the best advances in our goods and services and in our overall standard of living and quality of life, those came from freedom. Little to no regulation of this institution called the market. Markets are just nothing but pure commerce, pure trade, free people negotiating with each other and exchanging with each other. And out of that, a couple of them actually command the resources, including human resources, meaning employment and jobs, right? They bring those resources together, they meet a whole bunch of demands, raise our standard of living, and they become billionaires as a byproduct. And then you're going to hear people talking about injustice, right? How can it be fair that someone like that has 100 billion and then the whole 1% have more than the bottom 40%? These are difficult issues because we've got to weigh different things. On the one hand, we've got the production of jobs that wouldn't have been there, and we've got goods and services that wouldn't have been there without that. But on the other hand, this same system also produces inequalities. Now we got to figure out, is an inequality the same as an injustice? If there are inequalities, does that mean that the system is automatically not just? These are delicate issues, guys. And that's why before we get directly to existentialism, I've dedicated 1 week to political philosophy. Because politics, as you can see, and ethics are going to go hand in hand. Why? Because the political system you choose is going to determine the kind of environment in which you either are going to have certain ethics or not. Aristotle also wrote a lot about politics. And he believed that the meaning of politics, its function, was to create an environment in which human beings can flourish. But his understanding of flourishing was not primarily material, not in terms of material goods or standard of living as we think of it in America. For him, he means primarily moral intellectual and social development. That's what he means by flourishing. So people having a lot of leisure and spending most of their energy and time on ideas and exchanging ideas and refining ideas and contemplating God, contemplating the universe, contemplating mathematical truths. That's the kind of thing he understood by the role of politics, right? So guys, I'm just giving you all this ahead of time so that you can see we're dealing with heavy, heavy stuff here. No one has figured all this out. I certainly don't, but I'm just inviting you to participate in this discussion. All right? We're almost done with the introduction. Last thing I want to say about ethics here. Even though I've said that this is ethics and axiology and redundant metaphysics, actually that's not really true. We have metaphysics right amongst us. Can I tell you why? We're talking about good or bad people. Generally, when we talk about a good or bad person, we're either talking about their personality or something we call their character. Someone has a good character or a bad character. Guys, here's a little insight for you. If you slice open a human being and you dissect them, and you look through their ribs and their marrow and their tissue, their heart, their lungs, their brain, you will not find a character. The same character is not an object, certainly not a physical object. So that's metaphysics, right? That means that as I look at Nick, I cannot determine his character just by observing his body or any part of his body, external or internal. The only way I can understand someone's character is to understand them outside of the purely physical aspects of them. I'm going to have to interpret his actions, his feelings, his thoughts, and that is non-physical. It's a non-physical aspect of him. It is metaphysics. It doesn't have a location. The character does not have a location in its body. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? All these things are interrelated. Okay? So we're not done with metaphysics. It's just that the aspects of metaphysics that are relevant to ethics have changed. They've reconfigured themselves. All right? All right, guys. So the goal today and next class is to get through the first theory of ethics called consequentialism. And in particular, there's one version of consequentialism that has been very, very influential. It's called utilitarianism, and it was invented by two Englishmen called Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. That's what we're going to spend the rest of this week getting through. But before we get there, I do want to touch just a little bit on this other aspect of axiology other than ethics. Aesthetics. We aren't going to go into detail this semester on aesthetics. I gave you the reason why. But I am going to sort of just introduce you to some of the things you might think about when you're trying to sort out aesthetic issues and think about them a little deeply. So I'm going to share with you three major aesthetic theories, and then I'll share with you a little bit of art and get your reaction to those pieces of art, and then we go into consequentialism. Okay, guys, so aesthetics, remember, is the study of what is beauty, what makes something beautiful, what makes something artistic, what is art, what is it to have good taste. When we say, he's really elegant, he has good taste in clothes, he has good taste in fashion, he has good taste in furniture. What are we saying? We say the ancient Greeks had really good taste in architecture, particularly the Athenians or the Corinthians or the Doric. You know, what are we saying that have good taste? What does that mean? All right, guys, there are three big theories of aesthetics. The first is what you might call the imitative theory of ethics. Of aesthetics. Imitative theory of aesthetics. The imitative theory of aesthetics basically says this. What you're really doing in a work of art, and what really makes a work of art artistic, is its imitation of life. and the world. So basically, what really makes a work of art artistic under this theory is imitation. So the artist has some object in front of him, and then he has some medium in which he's going to capture a representation of what's in front of him. Now that might actually be a physical object. It might be an animal like a lion, or it might be a life, right? It might be kind of biographical. So it might not be a physical thing, but it might be someone's life, and he's just going to represent that life in words or something like that. So that's the first theory. You imitate something, and you make a representation of it in a new medium, and what makes something art is that imitation, the representation of something in life or the world in a new medium. All right, there's a second theory of what makes art. Second theory of what makes art is what you might call formalism. Formalism basically says what makes art art is not the imitation of something. Rather, it's the internal, intrinsic organization of the different elements of the art with respect to each other. So you don't look outside the art to figure out whether it's art. You look purely internally inside the art, the work of art, and you say things like, okay, are there certain features in this art, like harmony, proportion, balance, symmetry? What about the effect of the color? How has this artist treated color in this? Things like that. So the organization or the structure or the form of the art, that is what makes it art or not. And that's also what makes it good art or not. And for this, just to give you some perspective, in ancient Greece as well as in the Renaissance, they definitely followed this kind of second school of thought, where principles like harmony, proportion, and balance typically guided the entire composition of the work of art. And composition itself was the real artistic skill, composition. Putting things in relation to one another such that they form a unified whole in which there is deep harmony and proportion across all aspects of the unified whole, right? So if you look at the Mona Lisa or Michelangelo's, what's the name of the one in the Sistine Chapel? The Sistine Chapel. So God touching man, does it have a name? I know it's on the Sistine Chapel, but I can't remember the name right now. But that's Michelangelo, right? And then Michelangelo also did the statue of David, other things. So those are different examples of artists who judge the beauty and perfection of their art based on its compositional excellence, which incorporates these aesthetic principles that were very popular with the ancient Greeks. And then finally, we have the third theory of what makes art art, which is emotionalism. That is, what really makes art art, and especially what makes art good art, is that it moves you deeply. It evokes feelings. It brings out deep, powerful feelings. And definitely, guys, when it comes to music, I think music, oh man, out of all the arts, maybe poetry is a rival. Poetry and music, they have this deep, powerful way of moving you deeply. I guess the right cathedral can do the same thing. The right painting can too. But if you look at the history of music theory, some philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, they straight up said like music is the perfect art. And I think it's precisely because it moves in such a passionate way compared to the other arts. So they thought that it's in a category of its own compared to representational art. Think about this, music doesn't quite represent something, not typically, but painting, poetry, sculpture, there's a representational aspect. So philosophers like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, they said, hey, there's something that's going on with music that's metaphysical because it's not representing. And then just one more comment about the imitative stuff. Plato, actually, I don't know if I told you, but Plato was one of those young youth that got corrupted by Socrates. Initially, Plato was an aristocrat. I think he was groomed for a career in politics to be a statesman like Pericles or something like that. But he was writing tragedies when he was really young. He was going to be like Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides. And he had so much potential, but when he met Socrates, he started despising art, especially when compared with philosophy. And he burned all his tragedies, he destroyed them. And later on, when he became a philosopher in his own right, in the Republic, for example, he wrote this book called The Republic, he said some pretty bad things about poets and other artists. And he said in his utopia, in his perfect society, he would regulate art very heavily. Artists would not be permitted to show indecent things. Go ahead.
What's his biggest thing on why art is bad, or like how it
You want me to tell you? Yeah. I'm eager to tell you what his biggest thing was. It was metaphysics. For Plato, the first theory that I shared with you is the true theory. Art is imitated. And that's bad. The reason why it's bad is for Plato, we didn't talk about this in this class, but for Plato, this world we're in is very much what Heraclitus said was, in flux, right? Now to Plato, that means it's imperfect because there are no beings here. Everything is in flux, so everything is becoming and passing away, generating and decaying. So there is no being here, right? So for Plato, he doesn't look at particular beautiful things or particular good things or particular existent things. He always abstracts away and says, what form or pattern or idea are they imitating in another world? Platonic heaven, you call it, right? So this world is imitating a metaphysical world, a heaven, right? And he says that's bad enough. We're living in a world of illusion, full of flux, full of deception, and we can't even know anything technically here. The only place we can know things are in Platonic heaven. Okay. So this world, because it became perfection, it's purely imitating another world, right? And then you got this guy called the artist who imitates things in this world. So things in this world are imperfect because they're imitating a perfect world. And now an artist comes and imitates an imitation. In other words, makes copies of copies. So that's cheap to him. You aren't accessing truth or real being. You're just making very, very, you know what I mean? Poor quality, cheap stuff. So from his point of view, an artist like Homer, for example, who tells a story about the Iliad or the Odyssey, from his perspective, there's two really bad things going on. The first imperfection is what I just told you. He's not telling stories of true being. He's imitating this world, which is itself a cheap imitation of a perfect world. So that puts it really low tier, low value. Then on top of that, we human beings, and especially young people, are very impressionable. So if you've got Homer with different gods fighting with each other in the Iliad, and Hera is angry at Zeus for sleeping with some muse, and Achilles is like furious because Agamemnon takes his girl, and the problem is if you have a very immoral tale or narrative, people are going to be moved by it and they're going to imitate the immoral aspects. You see what I'm saying? So Plato is a very straightforward, kind of how you say, upright person. He's very moralistic. And so he's judging these poets like Homer and saying, man, philosophy can do better than poetry and art. Artists don't have standards. They imitate good and bad. But for Plato, what needs to be imitated is only the good. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it's like the influence on like other people.
The influence. In Plato's perfect world, there are many arts that would not exist. He would censor. Yeah, Plato is a bit of a, I don't know if it's a communist exactly, but he's very totalitarian. Every aspect of society would pretty much be regulated, micromanaged, I think he has good intentions, but there wouldn't be much freedom in Plato's Utopia. That's true. So you would censor art. You wouldn't be allowed to listen to whatever art you want. You wouldn't be able to go on YouTube or Spotify and just chillax for hours listening to who? I don't know, Reggaeton or Linkin Park or Chris Cornell. He wouldn't allow it. He would he'd say no, that's wrong. So those are the three big theories, guys. And before I show you a few pieces of art that you react to, I want to know from each one of you, which one do you identify with the most? Out of your own experiences with art, I just want you to say one or two sentences about which theory you think is right and why. And tell me which art you really like. Are you into architecture? Are you into painting, music, sculpture? I just want to hear from every one of you, but it doesn't have to be long. Go ahead. Music? Okay. So, if it's music, which one of those three theories kind of best explains your understanding of music as an art? The third one? Oh, I mean, is it imitation? Is it imitation? Is it formalism, or is it emotionalism? Like what? Music, right? Emotionalism, right? Yeah, I can definitely see that, man. I can see it. I can see why. When I look at, Mozart, Beethoven, like Mozart's sonata form for his concertos, for his symphonies, he follows a very rigid structure in which there is a lot of symmetry. And the development of his melodies and harmonies is very compositional. So someone like Mozart would be what we call classical music. Not classical in the sense of Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich. Like all of that is called classical music, right? But within that, there's actually a classical period within the history of classical music. There was a romantic period too. Now, the classical period within classical music was very compositional. Like literally, you had a sonata form. You had to follow a certain form in the development of the four movements of your symphony. Now, that restriction also created a new freedom. So obviously Mozart was very creative. He was restricted, but he did brilliant symphonies. But people like Beethoven threw that off, and they invented a kind of romantic movement within classical music, and that's what they identify definitely as much more feeling-oriented. Like the ability of Beethoven to move you, he took it to a level that Mozart never really took it to. Mozart had the potential, but Mozart accepted restrictions and restraint, whereas Beethoven took it to a new level, and certainly Rachmaninoff and others. All right, go ahead, Brandon.
I would probably say that Mozart starts out as imitative, but I think it leads into emotionalism as well.
When you say it starts out as imitative, are you looking from the perspective of the artist? Like when he's learning the art, he starts off imitating either nature or earlier artists, and then eventually he starts putting in his own emotion. Is that what you mean?
I think when an artist creates art, it's out of a desire to express something, whether it's a desired goal, something that's happened to them, or maybe just another thing within the art that they participate in.
Yeah.
But I think out of that, the desire to have to present the art a certain way leads into emotionalism.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, Nick.
I would say relating to movies and TV shows, like for the market I like the consumer was.
Yeah.
Imitative theory and emotionalism.
Uh-huh.
They take aspects from both because I think what makes like a film or show really good is no matter what it's about, it can strike you emotionally.
Yeah.
There's an extra connection, but then also I think the best films and movies have to do with displaying an aspect of life or a part of the world that
Right.
misunderstood, and then they relate it to something that
Excellent. So what you're saying is for the imitative side, the plot, right? Like, the plot has to resemble real life, otherwise it won't be credible, right? So whether it's Breaking Bad, whether it's whatever it is, you can tell a completely new story, but the overall plot development has to be realistic in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And that's the indicative part. But what you're saying is, even within that, you gotta have a couple of episodes where person either is shaken or has a nervous breakdown, right? Something that really connects you with them, even if they're an anti-hero, right? Even if they're the bad guy, you gotta have something human that you connect with them. And I think emotion is that thing. Go ahead, Carter.
Yeah, I mean, probably music for me, is like, I gotta make music personally, and, I kind of definitely agree that, like, a lot of it's emotionalism,
Yeah.
but like, I feel like nowadays, especially with like electronic music, it's sort of like more starting to shift towards like formalism that, like, everything you like compose is like so, like, technical nowadays, and that's like a big, like, issue, like, with like certain producers that, because, like, some of the best songs ever, I haven't had like the best technical features about them, but like, people love listening to it, you know? So like,
Interesting.
it's that fine line between like having like a very structured song and like really like,
So let me ask you this, you mentioned electronic music. Do you mean EDM?
yeah,
So you mean someone like Calvin Harris, right?
yeah.
So what is your opinion of Calvin Harris? Is he more of a structured, purist, technical guy, or does he just do whatever feels good?
I think he's definitely like pretty technical, but like he also has like on the top like elements that.
Oh, I see. Like Ellie Goulding, like working with Ellie Goulding, or, okay, all right,
So
yeah.
like, he takes, and like I guess like pop has less technical like restrictions compared to like certain subgenres, but he like combines that.
Absolutely, guys, yeah. I used to be an EDM a lot, I still do a little bit. I think the first show I ever went to was in New York, Central Park, for Paul Van Dyke. And that was in 2005, of a long time ago. And then eventually I saw Tiesto and Paul Oakenfold. Recently I've been getting into an Australian drum and bass group called Pendulum. I don't know if you've heard of them. Really, really good.
Yeah,
You probably have? Yeah. They're really, really good. So, guys, I'm going to conclude the aesthetics with two things. First, I'm going to ask you, on what basis could you judge one work of art to be better than another? How would you figure that out? And I'm going to give you an even bigger burden. Remember that term subjectivity I talked about earlier? So there was a metaphysical subjectivity of Descartes, right? Like, how do I know these things in front of me aren't just ideas, but they're actually objects out there in the real world, right? That was metaphysical subjectivity. But I want to give you a huge burden here. When it comes to art and even ethics, you have to start out with a huge burden. It's subjectivity, but a different kind. Obviously, one person likes Calvin Harris, right? Another person might like Oakenfold or Van Dyke. Now, those are two different values, right? One person values one work of art, another person values another. On what basis can you say one of them is right or wrong about their taste? Or on what basis can you say one work of art is better than another? I just want you guys to think about that. Think about all the discussions you've ever had with your friends about art. Think about all the criticism of art you've ever heard, where someone says, oh, Shakespeare is definitely much better than, I don't know, Socrates. Or, no, someone says Scorsese is much better than, Scorsese is much better than, who did the Godfather series, the director? Coppola. Scorsese, yeah, someone says Scorsese is much better than Coppola or Kubrick. Now, on what basis do you even support such a claim? Objectively, right? Not subjectively. Hey, value, this is why values are so interesting, guys. Values are this interesting part of being human. It's amazing that we value things. And it's even more amazing that we value things differently. And it's even more amazing that some people claim that they can tell which one of us is right or wrong objectively, right? And say, you know what, Shakespeare is the greatest dramatist in history. No one has ever beat Shakespeare. Mozart is objectively the best classical musician in history. Some people say things like that. Some people write books like that. Some people dedicate their whole careers as academics supporting that kind of thing. And I want some sense from you. How do you feel about that? Do you think we can ever support an objective statement like Shakespeare once we clear ourselves of our cultural biases and little prejudices and objectively say, you know what? As I got older, I really started to realize that Macbeth and Othello and King Lear and Hamlet really are the best works of art I've ever seen. Go ahead.
You have a difference of objective opinion and subjective opinion.
So you're saying you yourself have both a subjective opinion and an objective opinion, and you're aware of the difference between them. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So okay, that's interesting. So someone can say subjectively I like Beethoven, but objectively I can see why Mozart is better.
Right.
Well, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's like, and there's also like a point where I think for a lot of art, I think people like common people love to like those people that like dedicate like their lives or like their jobs to like, being expert in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I said, let's take like say like Billboard, the top 100.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people, that's where you get your most objective influence. And like I feel like people like look up to them and they have like a lot of influence on like even people's subjective taste as well.
So, okay, this is a very interesting point that you raised here. I'm going to rethink about it this way. Can you be born with a natural taste, and then on top of that, you get educated, right? And then you develop a separate taste from that, and that educated taste is what we regard as the true correct one, also known as the objective one. But you still have this, you know what I mean? Like I remember when I was growing up, the rap group I liked the most in my teens was Wu-Tang Clan, right? But as I got older and I really started to understand lyrics, I really couldn't give any member of the Wu-Tang the title greatest rapper in history. After I listened to Nas, after I listened to Tupac, you know what I mean? Like, I like Wu-Tang, I like their style, but if we talk about lyrics and things like that, like Nas is better, you know? And Tupac is more poetic. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Where you might have something you really like just at a very fuzzy personal level, but as you educate yourself and start to recognize objective elements in art, I have a similar experience with Shakespeare. Once I really started reading like Hamlet, Othello, Macbeth, the phrases that he uses and the emotional impact that certain passages that Shakespeare has, it blew me away. I'm like, I've never read anything even close to that. Not in prose, not in poetry, not in any literature I've ever had. I've never had someone who astonished me just using words that way. So, you know, I mean, I might still like, I don't know. I might still like whatever I read, but in the back of my mind, I'm like, there's a standard now that I'm aware of, you know what I mean? What the rest of you think? Do you think you can have objectivity in art?
The way you brought it up, saying that objectivity is based on just the weird, I guess, the truths that you hear, that can be kind of tricky too, because like now you're basing your objectivity on the basis of what everyone else is.
So, yeah, that's right. So a kind of consensus, right? That's kind of like science, right? I can see why it's legitimate in science, because you want whatever test is supporting your hypothesis to be reproducible. And if they can do the experiment on their own, then you get a consensus. But art is tricky, man. Why should a young man identify more with Hamlet than, say, I don't know, Anakin Skywalker or or something, you know? If you grew up on Star Wars and you identify with Anakin or Luke, how would you objectively say, no, you should be identifying with Anakin? He is more human, more universally human. You know what I mean? That's the kind of thing that art, literary critics and art critics would want to say. You know, Shakespeare invented the true human. That's the kind of thing I've read in literary criticism. And it's compelling, right? I can see why they say that. But then there's also other issues, like cultural issues, right? People from different cultures are going to judge art different. And certainly from different historical periods. So, you know, an ancient Greek might say that Shakespeare is a wild genius, but they would say, as excellent as his writing is, you shouldn't imitate it. And certainly it's not very instructive for young artists. It's going to mislead young artists. A literary critic is likely to say, if you imitate Shakespeare, you're going to imitate the wrong things, not the poetry, but the rhetoric. You're going to have very brilliant, striking lines, but there's not going to be that unified whole that we call true composition. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. You know, we have, what, 5 minutes left? I just want to hear from you guys, like, what are some of your favorite works of art and why? And do you think that's just subjective, or are you willing to argue for it even objectively? Go ahead.
I'll talk about something. So I like paintings a lot.
Uh-huh.
And one of my favorite paintings is a painting by Henry Matisse. It's called Goldfish. You could probably pull it up.
Let's put it up.
So I don't have an objective argument for this, but
Right.
for me, it's kind of like a memory booking type of deal. That's where art kind of stated because it brings me back to when I was much younger. I always go to the gardens in my local town with my family. So that's kind of the feeling I get.
So, I certainly think it's beautiful art. So what is it about it?
Complexity in the color.
Also,
There's a lot of variety.
all right, guys. I will see you next time. So we're gonna do some attendance, and then we'll continue next time. Don't worry. We'll figure out some way to get through consequentialism and a few examples. But I just wanted to introduce everything properly and show you some of the burdens we face now with values, right? It's a huge, huge burden. You know, there's this myth of objectivity, which comes with critical thinking and open-mindedness, right? Which is, if you just fight your biases enough and you get rid of all your prejudices, you will enter this neutral state where you are impartial. And you'll somehow be able to judge things as they are. But is that a myth or is that real? Because guys, how in the world are you going to say that, I don't know, Kurt Cobain is better than Chester Bennington? On what basis can you do that if it's not subjective? I mean, isn't to take interest in art necessarily a kind of bias? It's moved you, right? Isn't that intrinsically a bias? Isn't that intrinsically a prejudice? Maybe all prejudices and all biases are not bad. Maybe there's some good biases to have. Kind of like the respect for life, right? If you go around respecting everyone because they're alive, that's a kind of bias. I don't think that's objective, but I think it's a very good one. It's actually something we might want to encourage. Anyway, class is over. All right.